Welcome back to the Granny's Stitching Studio, and today we have Katie behind the camera, and I will be doing some stitching to show some of the stitches that are used in our Out of the Blue pattern. And so we're so glad that you're here with us today, and I hope we cover some things that you maybe have questions about. But if we don't cover something and you really wanted to see it, please let us know. You can send us a message. How can they get a hold of us, Katie?
You can call us 507-377-0771, or in the comments below we'll put our email address and that phone number as well.
Okay, so now we have been working on Out of the Blue. We're going to be covering some of the stitches, and Katie has in your pattern, every single week you will have one of the layout sheets. You'll have a stitching detail sheet that will show every single detail you need to know for how to do the stitching. So we're going to start today with the blue bloom or the butterfly, and they're done similar. So I've got a little scrap here, and I only did a little scrap so that we didn't have too much and you could, the camera could concentrate on just this area. So I've got our medium blue thread, and the bottom petal is just going to be done with a small blanket stitch. So I'm going to do the knot here, and if you haven't figured out how to do this knot, if you can hold the end with your needle, you're starting it correctly, and then just wrap around 1 or 2 times. Sometimes it takes 2 wraps, and pull it down, and every single time you'll get a perfect little knot at the end. So then I'm going to use a little bit of the thread wax, and you can see my thread wax is almost gone, and there's some little fibers in there, and I ignore those. They don't bother me one bit. I've never had one where it comes off and gets on my thread yet. So I pull my thread through that, and we're just going to do a small blanket stitch around the bottom petal. So this is what I'm considering our bottom petal. So I'm going to use rather small stitches to do the blanket stitch on that. Your stitch may look different than my stitch, and you notice I do the blanket stitch from left to right. It's like how I write. I find that when I do a left to right blanket stitch, my thumb is always there to hold the stitch in place. So now when I go around the corner, I'll show a little trick. And when you pull your thread, if you pull it straight to where you want your stitch to be, if you pull this way, it's going to slant your stitch that way. Pull this way, it's going to slant your stitch this way. But if you pull your thread exactly the way you want that stitch to appear, it makes a perfect stitch every time. So then I just place my thumb on it to keep it out of the way and go to my next stitch. Now as I pull that thread, I'm going to pull the thread the way I want that stitch to lay. And it works perfectly like that every single time. It is just a magical way to do your stitching. So pull your thread in a straight line the way you want your stitch to lay, and it works perfectly every time. So as you go around, I'll do a few more stitches and just finish this bottom layer just so you can see a little bit of the way I do the blanket stitch. Now if you go right to left, that's just fine. It's hard to change sometimes to do things a different way, but if it's easy, if you haven't learned yet, I would suggest trying to train yourself to go left to right, because your thumb is always in the correct spot to hold that stitch then. And I know most books will show you to do it right to left. However, I don't know why I learned this way, but I have an extra tool with my thumb then to help me out. So I've got this little point here. I'm still going to put a little stitch there just to hold that point in place and pull it to where I want it to be, and just go down and do the knot on the back. And there's several ways to do the knot on the back. You can just do the overhand knot, and that's most common what I do. Some people like to weave their threads back underneath the stitching. That's fine too. And some people take 2 little nibbles in the end, and that's fine.
I'm a nibbler.
You're a nibble. So that's our bottom layer. Now we're going to work on the top layer, and this is the same for the blue blooms as it is for the butterfly. So we're going to pretend that this is we're going to work this as a butterfly, but I'm also going to work it as a blue bloom so you can see. So you can see I'm doing that knot again. Put it on your finger, then do a wrap around 1 or 2. Sometimes it takes 2 with your thread. Pull it down to the end of your thread, and you have a perfect knot every single time. And then I'm going to use the thread wax and put some thread wax on here. My thread is actually longer than I usually would use. So I'm just putting pressure on it and pulling it through. And now this petal, and Katie tells us exactly how to do this petal. It will say on the blue blossoms, blanket stitch around the edge of the bottom petal using matching pearl cotton. Blanket stitch around the top petal with stitches extending from the center. So I'm going to start down here. And then as I go, I kind of work myself up and down a little bit on this center line. So I'm going to start in the bottom, put a little stitch in here. This one's slanty already from the beginning. And you can see it's got a little slant to it. And then it go close together. And now I'm pulling my thread diagonally up because that's how I want these stitches to radiate around this point. So now I'm not pulling straight out, I'm pulling diagonally up because all of these stitches are going to be a diagonal. I hope the camera is catching this, Katie. Is it? I have my fingers in the way or my thumb in the way or anything? So as you go, you just keep pulling, and you pull just gently enough to make a nice curve here. If you pull too tight, you'll lose your curve. So as you go up and around, you kind of have to keep moving your work. And I'm using my thumb to hold my stitches in place. So this one I might go up a little bit because the next stitch will cover that. There we go. So now as I come back down, it'll cover that I went up a little bit further. So it's not really necessary that all the stitches start at this bottom point. As you work your way back down, it will cover the fact that they're... So I'm just going to hold that as I go around. And your stitches can go closer together or farther apart. You can just decide how it makes it easier for you. And just keep radiating right around that petal. It makes kind of an interesting texture to that petal. If you can't quite get the hang of it, you can always just blanket stitch it. You do not have to do...
Or you can do long straight stitches too instead of blanket stitching.
So make it your own. You know, if you find a stitch that you would prefer to put down through the center, a feather stitch or something, that would be fine too. But as you come around here then, it completes that radiation. Now, here's the one trick I do to make it come together at the point. I go under that very first stitch and catch it. And it seems like it completes that point so perfectly when you do that, if you catch that first stitch. So I've gone under it, and now I'm going to come back in. And it just makes a perfectly round point on that. So catch the very first stitch that you put in. Sometimes that pulls out of shape too, and by catching that bottom stitch, it'll pull it back so it's straight in a point where you'd like it to be. So this is the blue blossom or the butterfly. Okay, I'm going to put the knot on the back. To make it into a blue blossom, you will be putting 2 or 3 straight stitches in the middle of your bloom. I think it's 2. So we'll do that next. So I've got my needle threaded with the V106 gold thread. This is the size 8, so it's the thicker thread. And once again, I'm not going to put the thread wax on this time because I'm going to be doing the bullion knot and I'm going to be doing a colonial knot. And we really don't want that wax on those knots because the coil has to be wiggled and moved around. So if I'm going to make this into a butterfly, I want a long body on that. So I come up at the top of the body, and the tail kind of curves around to the back here. So I've got one big long stitch, and I'm going to stick my needle out the top. Now your needle's just barely long enough, so you're going to have to use your entire needle. And then you start wrapping, and just keep wrapping and wrapping and wrapping. And you're going to have to put on like 24 wraps on. I haven't been counting, but
your wraps need to be as long as the stitch that you took.
Exactly. So what I do is I kind of stop after a few wraps, and I lay them out, and I see if the number of wraps looks about the same length as the stitch here. And I think it's a little short, so I'm going to try to wrap a few more on here. And sometimes you have to kind of wrinkle this up, because we're not using a bullion needle, we're just using our regular embroidery needle. So it's a little shorter than what we really need it to be, but in a pinch it works beautifully. So now I think I have enough on there that looks like the same. So I got these beautiful coils, and you can take a little bit of time and make sure they're all perfectly. And the trick is not to pull those too tight, because the eye of your needle has to pull through there. So if you're trying to do this with a chenille needle and having difficulty, it's because a chenille needle has a larger eye, and the embroidery needle, crewel needle or embroidery needle, has a smaller eye. So it's the same size as a shaft, and it will pull through all those wraps. So I've got all the wraps exactly how I like them, so I just kind of pinch them lightly and push my needle through, and just kind of twist your needle, wiggle, 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 and just keep wiggling. Be patient and just kind of pull it through. And as I'm going, you can see they're still wrapped there. I just hold it with, I need to hold my thumb on there. Now I'm all the way through. I'm just going to keep gently pulling the thread all the way through. Once it reaches this point, it's going to fold back over the top and come all the way through.
You move your left hand. There we go.
All the way through. And if one of the coils misshaped, you can give it a little twist and twist and twist and get them back where they're supposed to be. And just play around with them a little bit if it gets misshapen. There you go. It's just perfect. And then you go back down where you started, and you have a perfect bullion knot butterfly body just sitting there. Now if you want the curve to kind of stay where you'd like it to be, you can go back in here and put a stitch in, and that stitch, if you do it just right, will become part of your wraps, and it can kind of twist that body around where you want it to be. And it's right there holding it right in place when you have those long bullions. So then Katie's pattern will say, mark your antennae, and so you will stem stitch those two and put a tiny little lazy daisy at the top of that. So I'm not going to do that, because stem stitching and lazy daisies are something that we have covered a lot before. But the colonial knot is one question we have, so we wanted to make sure that the bullion knot is a question we have, so we wanted to make sure that we kind of showed that. So once you get your antennae on here, it'll look like a perfect butterfly. And I'm going to pull one down so you can see a butterfly all done on the work. So here's one already stitched with its body and the stem stitch and a tiny little lazy daisy there. So that's your butterfly. This other, let's see if we can grab, well, this is the other flower that you will be doing. We'll be doing different renditions of that throughout. So you have two long straight stitches and a colonial knot on this blue blossom. So I'm going to show you that colonial knot for that blossom. So once again, I will not be using thread wax, because when I do colonial knots, I do not want thread wax. I do it, but you'll find if you're having trouble, you'll want to not put the wax on. So 2 long straight stitches is pretty simple. Just kind of stick them in there, higgledy-piggledy, however you like. Don't pull them too tight or it'll pull up your background fabric. So you've got 2 long straight stitches, and then we're going to put a colonial knot at the tip of that. So a colonial knot is just grab your thread, go over the left and pick it up. So grab your thread, go over the left and pick it up, and then just wrap over the top of your needle and back down in. That is a 1 wrap colonial knot. And it works perfectly every time. Just an absolutely gorgeous knot. So I'm going to do it one more time here, and we'll do more when we get to the green, little green leaves. But so hold your thread, take your needle and pick it up from the left, over the top from the left, wrap around and back down in where you came up. And as you pull that through, you get an absolutely gorgeous knot every time. Now my rule of thumb is only wrap 1, 2, or 3 times. If you need a bigger knot than that, you'll need to use 2 threads or a heavier thread. If you pile them up any higher than that, I don't think they look like a colonial knot anymore. But there's no colonial knot police that's going to come around if you do a 7 wrap colonial knot. But so there we have the butterfly and the antennae and the beautiful radiating blanket stitch. Now let's do these tiny little leaves, and let me show you. I'll bring this down. And oh, look at there, I missed that one. Well, let's just do that and we'll fix it. Okay, I need to fix that. Every now and then when I go back through my stitching. So I'm going to do my knot, lay it flat on my finger, wrap it over, grab it with my thumbnail and pull it all the way through, and you have a perfect knot at the end of your thread. So now a little thread wax. So I just lay it in the pot and pull it through with a little bit of pressure. And it keeps your thread from fraying. It will keep it from making those knots when you're stitching. And it will protect your thread clear to the end. Your thread won't have a tendency to get smaller and smaller and smaller. So I could draw a little stem on here with my Iron Off pen. As you get going, you probably won't need to draw them on anymore, but it's kind of nice to just draw the line you're going to be following if you're at all hesitant. So I'll just draw those on, and I hope the camera is picking up that line.
It is.
So this is the Bowen Iron Off Pen, and it's just a wonderful wax pen, iron marker white, that gives you a nice line. If I didn't like it, I could take a warm iron and it would disappear. It's nice because it will stay on all the way till the end of my work. So wait for that to dry just a little bit, and then we'll start out. And I'm going to back stitch. Now when you back stitch, the tendency of some people is to get that first stitch from the bottom, but a true back stitch will start and go back from the beginning. So you start inside your work and then come back and do the back stitch. So you're always backing up. So even from the front, even from the very first stitch, you're going to be backing up. So you can see even that very first stitch, I started inside and I backed up. And I don't use very tiny back stitches. The purpose of the back stitch is to have a nice showy line like top stitching. However, sometimes it calls for tinier stitches if you're doing lettering or if you're going to be doing anything through press and seal. Tinier stitches will pull out a press and seal. So I've got my vein. Now I need to make my V's on here, and you can see the camera maybe can pick this up. You can see
Yep,
the
just give me a
V's.
second to get there.
You can see the V's.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. So what I do is I come up where I want to start that V or Y. You could think of it as a Y. And then I actually tip my work backwards towards me. And I go down. And I actually make this into one stitch. I go up for the other side of the V too and back down. So now I'm going to do my second one. I'm going to come up kind of parallel to the first V. And you can kind of lay your needle in there to let you know whether you like the way it's going. And I catch just the edge of my green leaf. Okay. And then I'm going to go down and back up again on the other side. So I kind of do it all in one stitch, one swing, rather than up, down, up, down, up, down, up, down. However, if you decide you'd like to do it up, down, it's your stitch. You can make it be whatever you'd like. So I'm going to go down a little bit for my next V, down in, back up for the other side. And we have a project called Live Simply, and it has, I think it's 55 or 52 leaves like this. And so you're going to be doing a lot of those if you're in our Words of Kindness club.
And they go really quick once you get started.
And if
it's a really fast way to do leaves.
And I just love the look of it. And if you get a chance to figure out how to do this, I call it a swing stitch, where you do two swing up and catch that second side. It goes quite quickly when you can do them both. So there we are, the completed leaf. Now our project calls for Colonial Knots here. And when we did the Colonial Knots, the first one was a 3-wrap Colonial Knot. The second one was 2, and the last one was 1. So it gave the appearance of that getting different sizes of them. So if you can see this right here, this one was wrapped 3 times, this one 2 times, and this tiny one just 1 time. So I'm going to show you how I did that. It's kind of fun. It gives you the same stitch, gives you a different appearance. So we're going to do one. So we grab hold of our thread, catch it up from the left, 1, 2, 3 wraps, and then just kind of gently tug it a little bit to get it just nicely and pull it through. So that's the 3 wrap. Now I'm going to, the one next to it is going to be a 2 wrap one. Grab your thread, snag it up from the left, wrap from the right, 1, 2, down where you came up. There's the 2 wrap one, ever so slightly smaller, and then the 1 wrap one. Grab your thread, snag it from the left, wrap it from the right, 1 wrap, and back down in, and you get a tiny little one. So there is the green leaf with the 3 knots. So following right along, the next thing I think we will do is the berries. And I have to thread a thread. So once again, I'm using my embroidery needle, and I pull the thread from the center of my ball. I'll show you that. So, oh, I'm so thrifty. If I finish something, I save. If the thread is long, I will save it. But I'm going to show you right out of the center of the ball. So I pull the thread from the center of the ball, and because of that, the little card will stay into the very end. So this is the M5 size 12, and when you go to thread your needle, these are tiny-eyed needles. You can put your thread down just between your finger and thumb pad, and you will be able to push that thread right onto the needle. so simply. So that's an easy way to thread your needle. I also have a tendency to always knot my thread where the came out here, not up next to the ball. So snag around, pull it up. Okay, I'm going to put some thread wax on. Just push down in there. Some people use your thumb. I use the first finger because I don't tend to ever have a fingernail that grows very long there. For some reason I snag it off so it doesn't get thread wax under it. Some people like their thumb to do that. And so now we're going to do these little berries, and they have stitches radiating around. So all I do is start at the bottom of the berry. And then I split the difference right down the middle first. And I don't come right next to it. I like to go out just a hair because this is kind of a textural stitch. And then down where I started. So hopefully I won't get my arm in the way here. So that split it down the middle. Now it needs 2 rays on each side. So I just go back up and put a ray here. Hopefully I get my arm out of the way before. And the last ray here. And here's one where you probably don't want to pull your stitches too tight, just tight enough. If you pull them too tight, it's gonna, because they're really supposed to be more of a decorative accent on top of your berry. So that's one side. Now I'll do the other side. So just snagging from the bottom and back here to the top. And that is a perfect raise on a blueberry or blue bud. I think Katie called them blue buds. Let me see what you called them. Blueberries. Okay, blueberries. So there you are. And then you will want to put a colonial knot with your size 8 yellow on top of that. So we'll quick finish that little berry with a colonial knot. I'm going to, oh dear, I dropped my scissor. I'll see if I can push it over to the cameraman and they can grab it for me. So at the very tip of the top, you just put 1 colonial knot. So hold your thread, snag it from the left, wrap it around and back in. So I think I did 1 or 2. Might have been 2.
It's just 1.
1, okay. I think sometimes I do 1, sometimes I do 2 there. You can make it be however you'd like. Thank you, Kitty. I don't want to get my shoulder in front of the camera here grabbing my scissors. So that is the blueberry. Now you'll also want to go back and put your yellow straight stitches in there. We could do that a little bit here. I'm going to put a little thread wax on for that because I'm not going to be doing colonial knots anymore. So I just lay my pot here, push down, and then the straight stitches are pretty simple to accomplish. Try not to be too particular. Just go out and in and out and in. I just work myself down from each side. Some longer, some shorter. I think it looks nicer if they don't have to be too particular, but if you want yours to look more exact, that's up to you, but it's pretty simple just to work your way down. And the thread with the variegated thread really does a lot of the work for you because as you go it changes color and it is so beautiful. So sometimes when they go down below a berry, I want the stitches to continue, so I'll just go from this way and slide underneath. You can come up and then slide under the berry. That's 2 ways you could do that, or sometimes you can put them so that it just covers right over the top of the berry. So that's how simple those stitches are, and the thread really, as it changes colors, is so nice. And see how I tried to make long, short, long, so they're not all exact. And I will get one here to show. No. This is how it looked. So I think we've covered everything in our stitch clinic, all the stitching that you'll be doing. Here's another case where the blanket stitches radiate to the line, and you'll draw a line and make your blanket stitching come to that line, and then a row of chain stitching right down there. So I hope this will help with some of your questions on stitching for the Out of the Blue. Thank you for joining us today.